AI data centers are coming, and they'll need a lot of electricity to function. But who'll be paying for the electric bill? The White House insists it won't be the American consumer. Its ratepayer protection pledge asks big tech and the utilities to pay for the new power plants, transmission lines, and grid upgrades themselves. But here's the thing, that promise is strictly voluntary. At the same time, the EPA is making some dedicated data center power plants a lot easier to build. So here's the question, is this smart deregulation paired with honest cost accounting or regulatory relief for the industry and a press release for the public? Joining me today to discuss this very interesting issue that's very much top of the charts in terms of search, none other than my friend, co host, and current nominee, or I should say, current candidate for the VP nomination of the Republican Party, Mr. Mike Tremont. Mike, how are you doing today?
Great to be with you, John. This is indeed a hot topic and an important one. It's one of those few topics that has the potential for affecting everyone in the United States at a retail level directly, not just indirectly, right? By jacking your utility or your electricity bill, your price per kilowatt hour. And at the same time, it has big wholesale and big political implications. And I noticed that you did not include in your introduction, but I want to talk about this eventually, enormous potential for corruption. So we're
Oh,
going to we're going to talk about that.
who would have thought the potential for corruption coming out of the Trump administration? It's something.
Well, one might argue that what they're doing could mitigate some of that risk if it plays out the way that we hope it would. My point is simply that anytime that you've got billion-dollar decisions, in some of these cases, 10x billion-dollar decisions being made by a relatively small number of people, the people that control the rate boards of the utilities and local politicians and governors. Uh, there's potential for corruption there, whether that's hard corruption, just bags of cash being passed around. By the way, don't think that that doesn't still happen. Not as often as it used to, right? Thankfully. But that sort of thing still happens. Just, Bob on the commission all of a sudden has a new swimming pool and no one knows where it came from. But indirectly, in the sense that it gives the government enormous latitude to pick winners and losers. And what does that mean for the revolving door between corporate America and regulatory agencies that we have seen for for a century now, that leads to money in the pockets of government officials, even if they have to wait some years to get it.
Right, and I think that's that you said a lot, and there's a lot to unpack, and I want to get to all of it. And also, let me preface this discussion by saying when we're talking about electricity, that's the main one, but there's also other public utility concerns, most prominently water usage when it comes to these AI data centers. So it's. I mean, we're going to talk about electricity and uh,
Yep.
power plants, Mike, but it kind of generalizes to just public utilities in general.
And I
So
should say, as a public service announcement, John, for all of our viewers, now would be a good time to pause in the middle of this podcast. Go watch the movie Chinatown, which is a movie about the corruption that comes from government agencies controlling a scarce supply of something that everybody needs, artificially, in the case of water, in the case of California, setting the price too low by subsidizing it, right? And then inducing everyone to use more water than they should, perhaps by growing grass in the desert, speaking of dumb things, and then eventually running out of water and having to fight over water rights. That's what we're trying to avoid here. That's
yeah,
what we're trying to avoid.
and like I said, this is such an interesting topic because top level, it just seems very almost simplistic, but there's so many there's a texture to it that touches a lot of aspects of the liberty perspective and of the Republican Party and just government in general. So let's start out with this rate payer protection pledge because like a lot of things the administration proposes, it kind of gives you the perception of a free market without actually having a free market. So this rate protection pledge, let me just pull it up because I don't want to do the president any injustice here. So the stated purpose of the pledge is to prevent the costs of new electricity generation, transmission, grid upgrades, and the related infrastructure for building out these AI data centers from being shifted onto existing electricity customers. Now, initially, you might say to yourself, wow, that sounds pretty good, Mike. We've got the government employing free market principles. You need electricity, go ahead, build out your AI data centers. You're responsible for building the XAI and
Yep.
Amazon and
Yep.
Google. Or you guys go ahead, man, free market. Build your AI data centers, but the costs of them are all on to you. Electricity, water, public
Yep.
utilities.
Yep.
Whether
Yep.
as libertarians we agree they should be regulated or not, leave that aside. The fact of the matter is they are regulated. It is subsidized in a lot of cases. It's, you can't just have rate increases and decreases. Those are all done by boards and government officials. It's not market driven for the most part. And yet, Mike, do you have, as a liberty uh, minded person, do you have any initial qualms over this ratepayer protection pledge that these large companies and utility providers have apparently undertaken?
Well, sure, but I think, of course, the answer is yes, and not just because of the potential corruption involved. Enormous potential for corruption exists without the pledge being instituted. I think it's important that we recognize the problem we're in now before the pledge, before the White House involvement. The problem we're in now is that utilities are regulated and the prices are not set by the market. So that means that if a big player, we're not talking about small players, it has nothing to do with small players, right? If you want to build a new house in someone's electric utility district, you're not going to throw off the rate structure and piss everybody off and cause enormous costs to be laid off on your neighbor. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so everyone settle down. What we're talking about is someone so big that it it causes the cost structure to change in one of two ways. Either it strains the existing electricity generating infrastructure such that electricity is more expensive than it otherwise was because maybe you've got aging infrastructure and pushing it to the limits means it's going to cost more, right? On a per kilowatt hour basis. That
Right.
would stink. Or everyone recognizes the existing infrastructure just can't do it. They need to build more, but building it is going to cost a lot of money. One way or another, having this big data center coming in, or any other kind of, this would apply to any other giant factory, right? General Motors or Toyota wants to come in and
Right.
plop down a giant factory in your utility district. All of a sudden, the rate structure gets screwed up. What happens is, because this is not a free market, because this is not, and that's worth a discussion, but that's a whole nother podcast. It is because these are what we call natural monopolies, right? Um, the market just wouldn't work very well if you just. It might work as well as it does now, but it wouldn't work perfectly, and so uh, communities have decided to take matters into their own hands and negotiate prices. Okay, having said that, a big player comes in, and what happens is the board sets the price to be equal to average cost instead of marginal cost. In other words, your factory comes in, your data center comes in, you impose all these costs on the community, and then that cost gets spread out over everybody. So everyone's rate goes up just a little. And you, as the new entrant, the new factory, the new data center, doesn't end up bearing all of the extra costs.
And let me just jump in because I have a very personal, similar experience from when we were youngsters, Mike. Back in the day, before the internet was on your phone, kids, the phone companies, the old dig a hole in the ground phone companies and run wires over your head, had to run something called ISDN into neighborhoods. And that's what allowed you to have back then what was super fast, the fastest internet and the connections you had. Every neighborhood that the phone company had to satisfy, the first person in the neighborhood who had to get ISDN for business for his business or to work remotely or whatever the case may be, bore something like 80% of the cost of the running that line. But what happened afterwards? Once the line was there, well, basically everybody for a certain, radius could get in at a lot lower cost because the capital expenditure to run the line was already borne by the first. There you go. So then in that sort of like collectivist type of thing, the first person in bore the cost and then everybody else rode for free. Well, think of it this way. Your community has already borne the cost for the existing electrical infrastructure. These AI data centers, and we're picking on them, but let's face it, AI data centers would be the largest consumers one shot of electricity coming into an area. They're going to ride on the collectivization of this, which, look, even giving the best intentions to the initial planners, as always, good intentions pave the way to hell, Mike, because now these AI companies come in and they're going to, at least initially, ride for free. Unless, of course, they keep their word to the president.
They're going to ride for cheap. And John, your example is excellent, but let me point out it's actually worse than that in many cases. In other words, that story would be perfect and would be complete if the new entrant were relatively small. It's worse when the new entrant is gigantic and drives up the cost for everybody on an average basis. It's even worse. So, everyone is trying to avoid these situations, not only where the cost of the existing infrastructure is spread out over everybody, they've already paid, the new entrant gets a free ride, that sucks. It's worse, everyone's price gets jacked because you've got to pay for the extra cost of this new giant entrant coming up that not only imposes new costs because of their consumption, but new costs because of the change to the infrastructure, either that you need more infrastructure or the infrastructure is stretched and stressed, and on a marginal cost basis, everything becomes more expensive. And so the analogy to water in the movie Chinatown, parenthetically, the analogy is that you will overbuild data centers more than efficiently because they don't take into consideration their costs, because their costs are largely laid off on others, or at least partially laid off on others. And you'll end up overbuilding or building in places that are inefficient for you to be building, right? And just like the overconsumption of water led to literally running out of water out west because of bad public policy, you could imagine a situation where we literally run out of our ability to produce enough electricity to keep up. That's what everyone is afraid of.
And Mike, I think, it's worth me interjecting here because I want to give you the opportunity as a good Austrian economist to pontificate on this. What's wrong with saying, all right, look, these utilities, they're for the public good. Why doesn't the government just get its smartest people and just come up with a new pricing structure that's fair to everyone? Talk to me why price controls, which surprisingly, again, coming from a Republican / allegedly conservative president who loves to talk about price controls coming out of Washington, right? What's the danger of price controls instead of letting prices adjust naturally in the market? What's the inherent danger? You kind of touched on it, you kind of circled the drain with it, but I want you to lay it out from, you don't have to get super nerdy, but just explain to us, why are prices better off being allowed to float freely as opposed to being regulated?
Well, in general, in a competitive market, we like the idea of the market setting prices because it will create incentives to keep the cost down, right? It forces the sellers to compete with other sellers to sell you stuff. And in order to sell you stuff, they got to keep the price down. In order to get the price down, they have to keep their costs down. That's the basic theory. So what happens when there's only one seller? In the case of utilities, there's only one seller. That's the case we're discussing, is when there is only one seller. And the reason there's only one seller is because the enormous cost of the infrastructure doesn't make sense to have two providers competing with each other, because it would cost twice as much. It would cost twice as much. So it's what we call a natural monopoly. The natural number for minimizing cost is one provider. Okay, if you have one seller, they're going to jack the price to whatever they want, right? You're going to pay $1 per kilowatt hour. You're going to pay $10 per kilo. You're going to pay $100. You're going to pay whatever they decide you're going to pay if you don't regulate that market. And so imagine people on the left, right? Not just Democrats, but socialists, and all of us as economists recognize that when laborers get together and form a union, they have more bargaining power with a corporation. And after all, a corporation is nothing more than a union, a unionized structure for capitalists, right? You negotiate with every stockholder, you negotiate with the union of stockholders that we call the corporation. And so there's nothing inherently unfair about a union negotiating with a corporation. It's just smash mouth politics. Who can unionize and strengthen. That's what the government does when it has a rate board control a utility. It, in effect, unionizes all of the ratepayers, all of the consumers, all of the residents in the utility district, so that they can negotiate with the corporation. And they say, no, we're not going to pay you just whatever you want. We're going to pay you a certain rate. Well, that evolved over time to be so sophisticated, I use the term fairly broadly, so refined, so detailed, I guess is probably the right word, that the rate boards set prices according to their costs. In other words, they force the utilities to open their books and show them what their costs are, what the costs are projected to be. They take into consideration all kinds of information. And the rate board sets a price that allows the corporation to make a little bit of profit, not too much. It's extremely socialized, right? But the alternative is to let the corporation decide. And no one is fond of that result either. So we have this weird situation that exists today without the White House getting involved. The situation today is that the utility companies have the ability to invite a data center in and lay off the costs. Now, why would they do that? Why would they lay off the costs on all the other residents instead of forcing the new entrant to eat all the costs? Well, because this is politics. and and the rate boards are going to be pressured by the governor, who wants a new data center, right? And all the local politicians who want all this big investment and want all the new jobs.
Right.
Right. So they want these data centers to come in, and the utilities can just lay off the expense on the ratepayers. Well, okay, there's a geographic problem with this too. What if your utility district is an entire state, right? Which is the case. In many cases, these utilities control multi-state regions. They're huge. So the benefits of having your data center come in could be relatively local, right? You imagine a data center comes into El Paso, and the people of El Paso are like, oh boy, they brought $1 billion of investment, and they brought 10,000 new jobs, and the jobs are going to pay a lot of money. This is very exciting. This is, we like this, and the local politicians love this, and the utility says, yeah, we'll go along with this, and everyone in the district is going to see their rates go up, but that's okay. They can eat it. Well, what happens if you live on the other side of Texas and you don't benefit from all this investment in these new jobs? All you get is higher electricity prices. You see where this is going.
Right, and and that's a good way of putting it. Like, utilities in the U.S. are so socialized. You're absolutely right. Like and again, surprising coming from Republican administration, so willing to embrace that aspect of it. And again, they're not alone in having done this. This goes back.
And the other point to be made, John, is what are you going to do about it? You're not going to suddenly desocialize the entire utility industry of the United States, which has been working this way for a century.
And you have that issue, and then you also have the ancillary issues, right? So it's not just the pricing for the electricity, the kilowatt hour, as you said itself, but there's delivery costs. Like when you look at your electric bill, I know one of the things that drives me crazy when I look at my electric bill is not like, okay, you're managing how much, you're managing your central air, make sure it doesn't burn too much electricity and all that. And then all of a sudden you look at your bill and it goes up, not just because of your consumption, but then you have transmission fees, delivery fees, point of origin fees, like when you look at all these regulatory fees that are part of the bill, you lose your mind because you start to realize that you don't know what any of this means. That
Right.
despite it being printed on your bill, the transparency is next to nothing. So,
No, you really have to trust your rate board. You have to trust these people who negotiate on your behalf with the utility company.
right. So now you're left in this thing where and again, one of the fascinating things about the US economy is sort of like when you hit these regulatory boards, and there's the politics of, we went through this, Mike, maybe 10 years ago when Amazon went on this warehouse building spree, right? Again, personal anecdote here, when they were thinking of building a distribution center in Long Island City in New York, coincidentally, yes, well, we're getting to her, but I actually had a studio pre-COVID in Long Island City, had nice low rent, you could afford it. You had a small business there, right? Amazon comes in. They announce they're going to build this, huge distribution center in Long Island City, New York. Oh wow, the revenue, the jobs, the opportunities, which was all true. What do landlords do? The second the lease is up, well, we're going to have all these new workers coming here. We need to convert some
It's
industrial,
naturally going to drive up the price
right?
of that and other things. Yeah.
Conversion costs, going from commercial to residential and vice versa. Free market at work, go baby go. Then AOC comes in, Congresswoman AOC, fresh to the game back then, famously said, "We won't go for this because you are getting 500, I think the number was 500 billion in tax credits, and we're not gonna give you that money." And again, there's a lot to talk about there, as if, someone was the government of New York was backing a Brinks truck to Amazon for 500 billion, right? But anyway, the point being that, of course, Amazon then looked at it and said, "Well, we're out." If now the political
Yeah,
environment,
we'll just go somewhere
we'll go
else.
somewhere else. What happened to Long Island City, though? People like me lost their studio because the lease rates had been jacked up, no longer made sense for me. So I had to go find another studio. A lot of people who had committed to moving into newly converted residential units backed out, right? Because it was a disaster economically, right? Similar to here. What happens now? What part of this ratepayer protection pledge are companies that are proposing these AI data centers, how much are they committed to, Mike? How much? Okay, so we're going to make these rate changes. We're going to give you your shot. What happens if the demand doesn't materialize? What happens if the estimates are grossly off because AI is a cutting edge technology? We've already seen the valuations fluctuate wild.
Well, and you're going to see failures. You're going to see certain companies fail. You might see a data center fail. What happens if you break ground and the data center is never completed? What happens if the data center is completed and needs one third the electricity you thought it was going to need because it never expanded? What happens if you decide to build a new electricity generating facility, right? And the demand that you expected to be there never materializes. Microsoft backs out, or the data center contractor backs out, and your community is stuck with the bill. This all has to be negotiated at the local level. This has got nothing to do with the White House,
Right.
but it all has to be negotiated at the local level. It is a problem,
Right,
right?
and oh, and let me jump in. You listed those costs, which you're very correct about, but then there's the other things like the regulatory concerns that exist. For example, you can't just upgrade a grid or add to a grid without taking into consideration environmental concerns. What happens for safety regulation? You have to protect against hackers, right? There's this maintenance cost that goes in. It's not a simple like they're building an AI data center here. It's going to cost 10, and then a lot of that is uh, non-refundable, if I could be glib, right? Like, so
Refundable, it's not recoverable. It's hard to turn off just because your demand doesn't materialize. Those are ongoing expenses. It's an extreme challenge to negotiate these contracts. And it's one of the reasons why only big companies are going to be in this game. Not only do you have to have the resources to commit potentially to new infrastructure, right? To keep the existing ratepayers, the existing residents from seeing the extra costs. That's a big commitment. You've got to be able to make the commitment robust enough that it outlasts this particular project. In other words, Microsoft signs a contract with a data center developer. Maybe the AI company is the data center developer. That can happen, right? But okay, together, they come up with this pledge. They're going to back up the utility company. They're going to back up the state, the community, the county. We're going to make sure that you don't see any extra costs. Okay, good. Everyone's happy. If that project fails and the community's already invested, the company pledging to keep you whole has to be big enough and strong enough that when the project fails, the company doesn't fail. And these projects are big, which means the company behind it has to be 10 times that big, right? You don't want to cut a deal with Bob's Chop Shop, who says we're going to build a data center, and if it doesn't work out, you're going to have to eat the cost of your new hydroelectric plant.
right, we declare bankruptcy, we're out. You're stuck with the bill, and but here's the thing, Mike. So let me toss this right out at you. Rather than a pledge, why wouldn't the Trump administration say you got to have certain capital requirements if you want to get into this game? Banks, for example.
Because that's a local decision.
Okay. Oh,
That's the answer, is that the Trump administration only has so many buttons to push because it's the federal government, it's not the local government, it's not the utility company. The utility company and the rate board, the price setting board, they have to be the ones that negotiate these deals. The reason the federal government has an important role to play here, and I commend the Trump administration. These are not words we usually speak. I commend the Trump administration for jumping in here and not completely screwing it up. And I say that because the president has accidentally, I believe, surrounded himself with a bunch of dinglings. So the fact that I think they largely got this one right by not going too far is commendable. The the reason they had to jump in is because, and there's value in jumping in, is because we all see, for example, governors competing with each other to lower taxes to induce automobile manufacturers to come in, right? The governor of Tennessee and the governor of Kentucky are at it. Uh, we'll lower tax rates. We'll lower tax rates even more. We'll lower tax rates and give you a break on unemployment insurance premiums. We'll give you that and more money. We'll just give you a subsidy. We'll give you a bigger subsidy. And all of a sudden, you're off to the races. It's a race to the bottom in terms of what communities charge, a race to the top in terms of what the community is willing to pay you to bring your factory in. And that is a competition that's bad for the communities. So the communities in this case, the states, the 50 states, in effect are forming their own union to negotiate with these big companies saying these are going to be the rules, right? Imagine OPEC controlling the price of oil and then hoping that no one breaks ranks. Someone does and ruins the story. But imagine the 50 governors get together, and something like 20 some have already apparently signed up with the White House pledge program. But imagine all 50 governors get together and say, no, we're not going to give away the store to these data centers. We're going to hold the line. These are going to be our basic terms. The details have to be negotiated at the local level, but these are going to be our basic terms. Our basic terms are you have to eat all the cost of your utilities. And that's going to take away the data center's ability to negotiate by pitting one state against another. So the states are, in effect, unionizing under the umbrella of the federal government that's saying, we want everyone to play by these rules. And the federal government doesn't have enormous leverage here, but it has some in the sense that, and here we know the Trump administration has done something really horrible in the past, but now they're going to cash in on it. The Trump administration regularly intervenes in markets to punish people that don't play by its rules and reward friends. And we all recognize that as a horrible way to run a government, a horrible way to do business. In this case, it's paying off because nobody wants to be in this situation where they say, oh, I heard the White House came out with this plan. I'm not going to follow those rules. I'm going to negotiate on my own with state utility boards, and I should do just fine, right? Maybe the Obama White House you would want to spit at, right? And say you're going to do whatever you're going to do. This is not the White House I would want to cross if I didn't want to wake up with a horse head in my bed.
I agree with you in terms of what you just said, not wanting to piss off the administration but the very reason that you're able to say that with a straight face in the United States of America is the very reason why someone has to do that, in my opinion.
Yes.
Right? So the fact that the Trump administration has very openly, like you said, the one thing they're transparent about is we are more than petty. You don't toe the line, we will use everything in our power to make life miserable for you. We saw it with Intel, we saw it with NVIDIA.
Yep.
Right? We saw it with XAI.
Yep. Terrible. Every example, terrible.
Exactly.
And that is why this would be better if it had come directly from the governors rather than indirectly. In other words, the right vehicle for this should have been, as by the way, it always should have been, is the National Association of Governors. They are the ones that should have banded together to bandy about the idea of not being picked off in negotiation by these automobile manufacturers, but they didn't. They allowed themselves to be played one against another. They should be getting together now to unionize against the data center contractors. And one more point, and this is the other leverage that the federal government has, is the federal government is saying, if you play by our rules, right, you sign the pledge and you agree to play by our rules, Not only will President Trump not embarrass you and sue you, which is always good, right? That's always good. But they don't actually say that part out loud. But in addition to that, we are going to waive the acid rain uh, emissions limitations program requirements.
The EPA, the EPA requirements. They're going to.
The EPA requirements under the acid rain program. The acid rain program says you're only allowed a certain amount of what is it, sodium dioxide, and you're subject to cap and trade, and you can't produce too much of this stuff. They say if you follow these rules, you eat all of your costs of producing electricity and don't impose them on the good people of your community, and you follow other rules, we will waive the acid rain emissions cap program requirements.
So it becomes cheaper to get unhealthy in the U.S.
Right. So there is an advantage. And I think everyone knows that the real big one is you don't have the president saying horrible things about you when you wake up one Monday.
I, Mike, everything you said is 100% accurate, 100% true, and raises my ire that much more. Because what you have just described is the classic crony capitalism. What you have just described is the classic political favoritism. You are literally describing corruption. You are saying if you are in the president or the administration's favored political class, you do not have to play by the rules.
Well, that's true, but remember the context, because I think, in fairness to the administration, to which I'm not completely given frequently, you're pitting cronyism against cronyism on behalf of the consumer. Because today's system is already cronyism controlled by these rate boards, right? And controlled by these data centers. So the data center can come in, negotiate a good deal, and lay off costs on residents that may or may not be all that geographically proximate. That's a problem. And that is a problem that is anathema to capitalism. That's a socialistic problem. And so what is being sought here is, how do you beef up the leverage that consumers have to offset this potentially corrupt, potentially crony relationship between the data centers and the utilities and the politicians who control the rate boards. And so people are trying to come up with a system to beef up the consumer leverage. And I agree that, it reeks of cronyism, and it presents new opportunities for corruption. But in its absence, in the absence of this White House initiative, you would still have all of the other cronyism and corruption. You just wouldn't have it offset, and the people who would end up eating the extra costs would be
Would be the
consumers.
little guy. So, and I know I'm giving you a hard time, Mike, but I almost feel like I have to, right? I still go back to why a pledge? Why the subtle little word games the administration is playing? For example, the administration said participating utilities in this pledge account for approximately 80% of the electricity delivered to U.S. households and businesses. And they're very, very careful in their wording, and they're very, very boisterous about it. This covers 80%. 80%. They're not, but let's be very, very clear. Let's be legalistic. 80% coverage is the market reach of the people who are allegedly signing on to, of the utilities allegedly signing on to the pledge. It does not mean that 80% of the consumers will be shielded from these increased rates. It does.
No deals have been cut yet.
Right. But even under the pledge's framework, that 80% that's being used to sort of like, hey, it doesn't actually mean that in their estimation, 80% of let's say the everyday household consumer will be shielded from these additional costs. What they're just saying that the
Right.
people who have signed on to this account for 80% of the electrical map, if you want to say the cover.
That's exactly right. Any set of deals could suck just as much as they would have anyway.
You're right. So to that extent, again, I have to ask, if you're trying, again, it's a socialist setup from day one with these utilities. We get it. To the extent that you're not going to revert to a free market sort of setup for the delivery of electricity and water and things like that, I get it. You can't go from 0 to 100 overnight. I get it. But if you're going to play this game, then why not just do this? 100% of the incremental costs will be borne by the data center builders, and that even given the understanding that there will be failures. This is not conjecture on our part, Mike. History has shown us the first movers, there's something like an 80% failure rate. There will be huge failures in this endeavor. Why not require capital requirements? Banks, for example, do this crazy business.
Well, I think that is a good idea. That's just an unrelated issue.
No, but I'm saying
The federal government is not saying don't bother with capital
right.
requirements.
But I'm saying why not make it why not why would we not expect, say, each look for each state, go ahead and publicize it, and I'm conflating federal.
I think that that is the next step. I think that states will say that they need huge capital requirements. I think the utility boards will say they need huge capital requirements. But their leverage in in making those requirements is substantially diminished if the federal government doesn't have this initiative in the first place. The White House initiative is contributing to giving uh, these rate boards more leverage because they're saying if you play by these rules, and the rules are you have to eat all your expenses, which is what we want. If you play by these rules, we'll waive your acid rain requirements and you will be flagged as someone who signed up for the pledge.
I know. I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just don't agree with it. Like I here's another analogy, consider it dopey or not. When a pro football team or a pro baseball team wants to switch cities, right? There are other states competing to bring that team in.
Like Illinois and Indiana competing for the Bears right
Right.
now.
Let them compete. They don't need federal guidelines for that. And look, honestly, as I'm sure as an economist or just someone who looks into these things, even if you're just a football fan, it almost never works out for the state that gets the team.
Yeah, but that is a good analogy. But the analogy is not with the federal government, it's with the NFL.
But that's what I'm saying. Why does the federal government
Because the NFL wants the franchises to be as valuable as possible.
I get that piece of it, and then but at least in that analogy, if you don't have this overlord adding another layer of unaccountable bureaucracy and favoritism. Like I agree, each state on its own could say, "Hey, guess how much regulation we have for you AI companies? Zero." Well, at least in that case, just like we've seen the migrations from out of California, out of New York to lower regulatory states like Texas and Florida, right? Like people will vote with their feet eventually, right? It may not be the most efficient thing, but at least it's better than these boards and one board after another, like colluding. There's no other better word. Colluding to make the average consumer miserable. Like if you're going to play the game that it's a regulated market, I would say let each regulated market that covers an area be the one to negotiate with these companies. And then, they're consumers.
But that is the way it's done.
Then why, again, I go back to remove the federal government from it then in that case. Really make it like 50, and I know there's more the number isn't exactly
Right. Let the utility companies battle it
yeah,
out.
50 or whatever number it is of them. Let them
And the reason this is a problem, the reason this has been such a hot topic the past 2 years, is because the utility companies, the the ratepayers, are getting their asses kicked by these negotiations. And so, in many cases, consumers have just revolted and said, NIMBY, not in my backyard. We don't want any data centers. So now we have this situation where the United States is going to fall behind in terms of the construction of data centers because the data centers have so much leverage in these negotiations that nobody wants them. So, how do you empower consumers to be able to negotiate a better deal? And the answer we've learned over the past couple years, although theoretically we've always known the answer, whoever is atomized and not unionized loses negotiating leverage. So, how do you form uh, a union for the consumers to negotiate with these people? And that's what this initiative is trying to do, trying to enhance the leverage against these data centers by saying, not only do you have to eat your costs, but but we're trying to create an environment in which you can't just change states and go find, someone weaker. We want the whole country to be a place where you have to eat your costs. That's the basic that's the objective, is to create that framework instead of having 100 different places, 100 different utilities all competing against each other in a race to the bottom, see who can give the most away. That's the situation we've been in the past couple of years, and consumers don't like it. And so now the data centers are going to be held back. So that's the object of the game. We don't know if it's going to work any better than it has the past couple of years, but we know that just allowing it to go the way it has doesn't work very well.
I agree, Mike, and I don't know, maybe it's my utopian libertarian outlook, but not utopian. Yeah, utopian libertarian outlook, but I think every chance you
Sure.
get.
And marginal cost pricing and the minimization of average cost, these are results of an atomized economy, right? And perfect competition. But but the question becomes, what do you do? What do you do when you have a natural monopoly provide uh, utilities, and then you've got huge players coming in after the fact, and in essence, as you described earlier, take advantage of the regulatory structure to minimize their own costs and lay off costs on everybody else? What are you going to do? What are you going to do?
Yeah, no, no,
That is an open question, and letting it go without any answer, as we have the past 2 years, is just another way of saying we want AI to be developed in a different country, and that may not be a good answer.
well, that's another question that needs to be assessed, right? Because the assumption is that we need to be number one at everything.
And I don't think that we need to be number one in AI, but I think that we need a robust AI industry. I don't think it's in our national interest from a defense point of view to have the great bulk of AI development happen outside the United States. Nor do I think it's in our economic interest for most of it to take place outside of the United States, considering its enormous potential to make money. And by the way, AI is going to be a bellwether for whether or not this country remains the kind of place where you want to do business. Right now, the United States is the number one place where anyone should want to do business if you're in a high tech industry. This is where you want to be. And I think part of the much of the reason that that is the case is because we've done a not a good job, but a better job than other governments have elsewhere in the world at keeping the government from screwing up our investment markets over the past half century, over the past over the past century and a half. We've, like I say, I don't think we've done a great job, but we've done a better job than other foreign government, other national governments have done in terms of preserving the environment in which people want to make investments. I would be very, very careful about compromising that. I agree. It's not clear to me that we have to, that the world would suck if we didn't dominate AI, but I think it would suck if we weren't one of the leaders.
Yeah, I could go along with that, and certainly, I guess, and we could end it on this. I still have faith that the United States and its people are the most productive on the planet, and I think a lot of that is largely due to traditionally the government getting the hell out of the way of entrepreneurs, getting the hell out of the way of markets. By and large, I understand. I'm not Pollyannish here. I understand it's never truly been a free market, but largely a free market, and largely government stays out of the way. I am concerned, as I was, say, in the '70s, with the the more left-leaning government, federal government, trying to run markets, and we saw the mess that was when it came to oil and other, things. I'm seeing it now, and I just think it's couched in a different sort of cloak, but I'm seeing, and it troubles me that I have to that we need the administration to tell us whether AI is an important industry, that we need even more guidance on how we manage growth, and how, like, if you wanna have some night watch say that says, hey, these AI centers shouldn't be poisoning the water and shouldn't be throwing particulates into the environment because that affects third parties that had absolutely nothing to do with your venture. I'm down with that. Fine, I'll agree with that. But even as we're seeing now, we're talking about loosening EPA regulations to allow for these data centers to be built because we have to. No, look, if you want the Bears or the Giants or the Raiders to come to your state, you bid on them, right? And the NFL, you know, rakes in the money. The state that wins usually regrets it. And we learn our lesson, hopefully, and we move on, right? There's referendums, there's bills, there's bond issues, right? There's ways of getting around this, that there is a public private relationship, Mike, in my opinion, that doesn't depend on the president's whims, doesn't depend on Scott Bessent's whims. That'll change after November, more than likely, right? After November, if
Yeah.
things play out the way you and I think they may play out, all of this is moot. Or largely moot in the sense that it gets approached. And by the way, when I say moot, I don't mean replaced by something better. It could be something more, like, you can imagine how Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, or AOC would approach this issue, right? It would be nationalize everything and let's dole electricity out with an eyedropper. I'm not suggesting what comes after President Trump is significantly better, right? Unless Adam Smith
Right.
comes out of the grave, or we play a Milton Friedman playlist on loop, right? It's not going to get any better necessarily, but I can only attack the stuff that's before me, right? So that's why I'm a little combative with
Right.
you today.
No, I get it. And I agree with your concerns future forward. If we knew that the program wouldn't go an inch further, we would feel a lot better. This is why I say it really should be handled by the Governors Association. It, it shouldn't be the federal government involved, not only because the Trump administration has a bad habit of getting too involved and leading to crony corruption. I don't even want to call it crony capitalism. Crony capitalistic corruption. New administrations in the future have all kinds of capabilities to screw this up. Imagine if they started setting more rules than just, we want you to eat all your cost, which is the popular easy one today, right? I think the analogy, John, let me see if I can try this analogy. Um, very popular today is the idea of showing ID to vote. So we have a very popular bill in the Senate that says, um, a complex bill in the Senate, but with a very popular piece that says you should have an ID to vote. But in that same bill is all this BS about proving that you're a citizen, and that's a pain in the neck and necessarily would cut back on how many people vote. By how much, I don't know. That's up to a debate. And what, the trade-off is there, right? We see the trade-off, and that's why the bill's popularity is only at the 50% level, whereas showing ID is popular among the American people between 80 and 90% level. Enormous. So imagine the analogy is the popular piece when dealing with these utilities is you force the data centers to eat all their costs. Everyone loves that idea. What could go wrong? What could go wrong, John? Nothing can go wrong. This is a perfect world. But what happens if either the administration wakes, I think this is your point, either the administration wakes up tomorrow and says we have more rules, or the administration changes and says we have more rules. The Democrats take over the House and they now want to legislate this and say we have more rules. And those rules aren't merely data centers eat their costs. Those rules are, we have something to say about how you hire. We have something to say about how you make AI available to people. We have something to say about how you distribute it abroad, how you distribute it inside the United States. Maybe we have something to say about how you generate your electricity.
Maybe we want access to all your AI prompts. Maybe we want to see what you're doing at all times. Certainly,
maybe we want a piece of the action. Maybe we want to own 20% of your company.
Not on, 15, 20,
John, what could go wrong? What could go wrong?
25 years ago, Mike, the younger me may have told you you're nuts, but the older, world-weary Big John tells you it's more likely than not that what you just described will happen.
And that's why we want this handled by the governor. I don't think it's going to. The governors have never taken me up on my suggestion in the past when negotiating with the car manufacturers, so I don't think it's going to happen now. But I understand your concern, and I share your concern. If we knew that it would go no further than right now, my applause would stand, right? Good for the Trump administration for not going further and not screwing this up. They've given the consumer some power. Now we're going to have these data centers eat their costs. Food's going to be tastier and colors brighter and music sweeter. What could go wrong, John?
What could go wrong, Mike? What could go wrong indeed? All right, everyone. We're wrapping up this episode. As always, I want to remind you to subscribe and like this episode. It helps us out with the YouTube algorithm, helps get Mike's message of liberty back out into the world. And Mike, to that end, please tell us about how the folks can find out about more about your campaign to become the vice presidential nominee.
Well, sure. Thank you. By the way, I was going to suggest folks go to our Substack, by the way, Mike Tremont the Future in Substack. A lot of folks read the transcript there, and it's very fun. The other thing I would suggest is go to miketremont.com, which is tricky to spell, but if you're persistent, you try 3 or 4 times, you can get to miketremont.com. Read about the campaign, which is designed not only to capture the Republican Party's nomination for vice president, but arguably more importantly, to empower our national delegates at the National Convention of the Republican Party in the summer of 2028 to select the vice presidential nominee themselves, have a floor vote so that the entire party is represented rather than just merely deferring to the presidential nominee, whoever that is. And I'm sure they will have if we were to allow it to one person again to make this important decision, which I think is a dopey way to do it, I'm sure they would come up with a wonderful idea, because all of our vice presidential nominees in both parties have been just wonderful ideas up until now. but I do think it's important that we follow a more legitimate and more democratic process for what is a super important decision, and we need to take it more seriously.
The only person in the administration that can't be fired is the vice president. So that person has to show a little bit of an independent streak. All right, Mike.
We want an ass adult in there.
All right, Mike. Thanks for that. And everybody, again, please go to MikeTermott.com, get some more information on Mike's campaign and the effort to get delegates empowered again in the Republican Party. So go ahead and check that out, MikeTermott.com. Also, as he mentioned, the Substack has the transcript of this episode, every past episode, plus a little bit of commentary. So go and subscribe to that. It's free. Go to the address there on the screen for the Substack for Mike's Substack. All right. Until next time, when we do this again,